Hi, I am Wayne Easter, a Member of Parliament for Malpeque, Prince Edward Island. Currently Public Safety Critic, have been Trade Critic. Well, one of the difficulties with a lot of the trade agreements that we have in place, and the TPP, the CETA, the Canada, South Korea agreements, they all build and expand on previous agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement. One of the difficulties with them all, and including through the World Trade Organization, is when there's a dispute. You have a dispute over, as we've had with the Americans, on country origin labeling on beef. By the time you take that dispute through the system, and the same thing will apply to intellectual property, by the time you take that dispute through the system, the damage is already done. In our case, in country origin labeling, our producers lost about $5 billion in terms of the beef industry. And I use that as an example, but the same thing will apply to intellectual property. So even with the agreements that are being negotiated right now, I do not believe there's the enforcement measures in them to do the job in a quick way to compensate a domestic industry that may have been compromised by something else the other country done. Well, I think your question really is along the lines that is Canada doing enough about threats from espionage and how that could impact on us? I think definitely not. We are seeing more instances of, or I guess greater knowledge that these things have been happening. The Snowden revelations have revealed two sides of the same coin. Actually, on the one hand, there's a considerable amount of espionage, commercial stealing, looking for industrial secrets that is actually happening. On the other side of the coin, there is an abuse of citizens' own rights within Canada and other countries in terms of how some of our oversight and intelligence agencies are using their authorities to basically gain information on individuals. There's the case in Canada of at several airports of a collection of metadata. And metadata, the government can say what it likes. But metadata is data on a lot of individuals, but actually from that, if you know the techniques, you can learn people's religion, their affiliations, what they do, where they live, and basically a lot of the things that those people do. So there's two sides to that coin. And I think we had to be extremely concerned about industrial espionage. Especially as we get closer to China in terms of trading relationships. They're well known. It is well known that a lot of what they do is based on information that they've been managed to glean either from companies or other countries. So we had to be very strict on that, and very strong penalties if found out. And I think Harper has opened up the door too far in terms of the CNOC proposal. He has allowed that one and said, well, there won't be another. Well, look, you've already set a precedent. Other countries can challenge you under international law, or other state-owned companies can, as a result of that international agreement. And if we want our own industries within Canada to be productive, to prosper, to make as their main emphasis the production, movement of Canadian resources employing Canadian people, then we have to provide our own industry with the incentives and sometimes the financial wherewithal, the investment capital to in fact do that. But if you expect our countries without any government whatsoever, and our companies without any government involvement whatsoever, to compete against a state-owned company from China that has the resources of the state behind it, then they're at an extreme disadvantage before they start. And so the bottom line here, that if a state-owned enterprise is going to operate in Canada, then you have to provide the same incentives to our companies so that you can actually compete in a relatively level playing field. And one of my big complaints about Canadian policy my whole life, whether liberal or conservative government for that matter, is the fact that we've allowed too much foreign ownership in this country who are not as interested in terms of Canada and its growth and wealth creation as they ought to be. We need Canadians, we need Canadian companies, we need Canadians working in those companies, they need the investment capital, and we need to produce and prosper for our own people within Canada. I mean, what other country would use resources like we have in energy, sell that energy to the United States as a prime example, so that the United States is using cheap energy to fuel their industrial plant to the disadvantage of Canadians where that energy came from in the first place. Makes no sense to me. So we need to look at our industrial policy and where we're going. Your question relates to what should the focus be for Canada's international trade policy, and I'd answer it this way. I think the government, Canadian government, although they talk about trade all the time, they've been an absolute, utter, and thorough failure on the international trade file. We've had the first annual deficit in trade, the merchandise trade deficit, in 30 years under this government. They will brag about having signed 9 trade agreements. So what? You've signed 9 trade agreements with the likes of Panama, Colombia, and a few other smaller countries. They now talk about the CETA deal, but we haven't seen the final text of that particular agreement. So while they've been negotiating deals, we've been losing on a surplus deficit basis in terms of our trade around the world. It's somewhere in excess of 34, 36 months out of the last 44 that we've had a merchandise trade deficit in Canada. That tells me their trade actions are not working well. I think where we ought to be going in terms of trade, we need, and I've suggested this when I was on the International Trade Committee, in fact, we should be holding hearings across Canada, meeting with the provinces, meeting with industry, meeting with stakeholders, and we should be asking the question, how do we make international trade deals work for Canada? What do we need to do to strengthen the manufacturing base? What do we need to do to add value to our products in this country? What domestic policies do we have to ensure to do within Canada to ensure that the prosperity of trade is actually retained within the Canadian population, and we get value out of the exports that we produce? I mean, a prime example right now, the government's bragging about trade. And they're talking about their changes, for instance, to the Canadian Wheat Board that has opened up a free market. Well, I talked to a producer yesterday. He said, you know, it's great, I can do my own marketing, but because of the transportation lockup, not a strike, because the railways are not moving product, I can't get my product to market. So what are we doing in this country to ensure that no matter where you produce, whether it's in Delisle, Saskatchewan, or Hunter River, Prince Edward Island, that you actually got the transportation and physical infrastructure in place to move that product to export position? What are we doing to ensure under infrastructure that we've got the investment capital, the technology protection in place that we can manufacture and expand their manufacturing base and add value within Canada on some of the raw products that we produce. And that's where we ought to be going on trade. Trade needs to be a comprehensive policy in this country, not just a policy we sign a little deal, now go to it, boys. We need a comprehensive policy that ensures that international trade benefits Canadians rather than just selling a cheap raw product that happened to have been taken out of the ground or out of the soil or produced in the soil in Canada and sold to somebody else for an international investor's benefit. Let's ensure the benefit comes back to Canada.